In 1984, country music star Gene Watson stood in his empty house, having lost everything he'd spent decades building. The man who gave us classics like Farewell Party and Love in the Hot Afternoon was now facing complete financial ruin. But what happened next would change country music forever. And today I'm going to reveal the untold story of how Gene Watson lost it all and the remarkable way he fought his way back. Before we reveal what happened that fateful day in 1984, we need to understand just how high Gene Watson had climbed. Born in Palestine, Texas in 1943, Gene was the son of a hardworking sawmill worker, learning early on that nothing in life comes easy. By day, Gene worked as an auto body repairman, but at night, his voice lit up every honky-tonk from Houston to Dallas. That voice, pure country gold, would eventually catch the attention of Capitol Records, launching a career that would help define the sound of traditional country music. In 1975, Gene released Love in the Hot Afternoon, a song that would shoot straight to number 3 on the Billboard country charts. This wasn't just another country hit. It was the beginning of a legendary run that would see Gene place 21 singles in the top 10. Think about that for a moment. While disco was taking over the airwaves and rock was getting harder, Gene Watson was keeping traditional country music alive with songs like Paper Rosie, Should I Come Home, or Should I Go Crazy, and his signature hit, Farewell Party. But it wasn't just the number of hits that made Gene special, it was that voice. Other singers would come to Nashville with affected twangs and put on accents, but Gene Watson was the real deal. When he sang about heartbreak, you believed every word because that voice carried the weight of authenticity that can't be faked. By 1984, Gene had everything a country star could want: a string of gold records, a busy touring schedule, a beautiful home in Texas, the respect of his peers. Even George Jones called him one of the greatest voices in country music. But here's where our story takes a dark turn. Because while Gene was on stage night after night, delivering those perfect notes to packed houses, something was happening behind the scenes. Something that would bring this country music success story to a crushing halt. You see, in the country music business of the 1980s, having a great voice wasn't enough. The industry was changing, and what happened next would test not just Gene Watson's career, but everything he believed about the music business and himself. The country music industry of the 1980s was transforming faster than anyone could have predicted. While Gene Watson was selling out shows with his traditional sound, a new wave of country pop was taking over Nashville. Artists like Kenny Rogers and Barbara Mandrell were blending country with pop sensibilities, creating a crossover sound that was dominating both country and pop charts. Even established stars like Conway Twitty and Mickey Gilley were adapting their styles to stay relevant. This wasn't just a slight shift in musical taste, it was a complete industry overhaul. Major labels were pushing for a more polished, urban sound. The raw, honky-tonk style that Gene had mastered was being replaced by synthesizers and string sections. Radio stations were changing their formats, and suddenly, traditional country artists were fighting for airplay with pop-influenced newcomers like Alabama and Oak Ridge Boys. But Gene Watson stood his ground. He believed in authentic country music, the kind that spoke directly to the heart with steel guitars and fiddles. His pure, soaring tenor voice didn't need fancy production or crossover appeal. This dedication to traditional country had earned him a loyal following, but it also put him at odds with an industry that was chasing new trends. And that's where things started to unravel. Like many artists of his era, Gene had trusted others to handle the business side of his career. He was a singer after all, not an accountant. He'd focused on what he did best, delivering those pure country vocals that had made him famous. But while he was on the road, playing up to 300 shows a year, the people he'd trusted were making decisions that would soon come back to haunt him. The first sign of trouble came when Gene noticed discrepancies in his touring income. Shows were selling out, but the numbers weren't adding up. The usual explanation was expenses, but these expenses seemed to multiply month after month. Gas prices, hotel costs, equipment maintenance, everything seemed to be eating away at his earnings. But the real problem ran much deeper than tour expenses. The changing industry had created new challenges too. Concert promoters were favoring the newer, crossover acts, Venues that had once booked traditional country artists for weeks at a time were now splitting their calendars with rock and pop shows. This meant more travel, more expenses, and less stable income for artists like Gene, who stuck to their traditional roots. Then came the tax issues, a nightmare scenario that would eventually reveal years of mismanaged finances and unpaid obligations. The IRS doesn't care if you're a country music star or a car mechanic. They want their money, and in Gene's case, they wanted a lot of it. Years of improper filing and questionable deductions had created a mountain of debt that seemed impossible to climb. But the real blow came when Gene discovered that his recording royalties had been severely mishandled. Songs that had played thousands of times on country radio, hits that should have set him up for life, had generated far less income than they should have. The money was gone, filtered away through a complex web of bad contracts and questionable accounting practices that would take years to fully understand. The industry's shift toward digital recording and new distribution methods had also created confusion in royalty accounting. Many traditional artists found their contracts didn't adequately address these new revenue streams, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation. Gene, focused on preserving traditional country music, hadn't realized how these industry changes would affect his bottom line. By mid-1984, the situation had become critical. The IRS was demanding immediate payment, creditors were calling day and night, and Gene Watson, the man whose voice had filled the Grand Ole Opry, was watching his world crumble one piece at a time. One particularly painful memory from this time stands out. Gene had just finished a show at the Big D Jamboree in Dallas, earning a standing ovation for his performance of Farewell Party. But instead of celebrating another successful night, he returned to his dressing room to find a stack of legal papers waiting for him. Among them was a notice of foreclosure on his home, the beautiful Texas ranch he'd bought for his family, the place where he'd thought he'd spend the rest of his life. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, singing about saying farewell in his most famous song, while literally having to say farewell to everything he'd worked for. The man who'd sung "Should I Come Home or Should I Go Crazy" was about to lose his home altogether. By the fall of 1984, Gene Watson had hit rock bottom. The voice that had earned him gold records was still strong as ever, but now he was singing for survival, not success. And what happened next would reveal just how low things would go before the most unlikely ally would step in to help save one of country music's greatest voices. The winter of 1984 hit Gene Watson harder than any Texas cold snap he'd ever known. The foreclosure notice wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It had become reality. The home he'd worked so hard to buy, the place where his children had grown up, was gone. The gold records came down from the walls. The furniture was sold off piece by piece, and the man once called the singer's singer found himself moving into a small rental house with barely enough room for a bed and his guitars. But losing his home was just the beginning. The touring schedule that had once been his bread and butter began to dry up. Word had gotten around Nashville about Gene's financial troubles, and in the cutthroat music business of the 1980s, that was like blood in the water. Promoters who'd once begged for his time now weren't returning calls. Venues that had welcomed him with open arms were suddenly booked solid. The 300 shows a year dwindled to barely 100, and many of those were at smaller clubs for a fraction of his usual fee. His band, the Farewell Party Band, felt the impact too. Musicians who'd been with him for years had families to feed and bills to pay. One by one, they had to seek steadier work elsewhere. The polished sound Gene was known for suffered as he was forced to hire temporary players or work with house bands who barely knew his songs. Some nights he'd show up to gigs not even knowing who would be backing him up. The press, always hungry for a fallen star story, didn't help matters. Headlines like "Traditional Country Star Faces Financial Ruin" and "Watson's Career Hits Sour Note" began appearing in industry papers. The Nashville scene ran a particularly brutal piece titled "From Hot Afternoon to Cold Reality, Gene Watson's Fall from Grace." Each article seemed to dig the hole deeper, making it harder for Gene to book the shows he desperately needed to climb out of this mess. Even his record label, MCA Records, started to distance themselves. In an industry increasingly dominated by the likes of Alabama and George Strait, executives weren't sure if they wanted to risk new releases from a traditional artist with financial baggage. The next album was put on hold, music industry code for "Don't call us, we'll call you." His latest single, which had been scheduled for release, was quietly shelved. The lowest point came during a show at the Texas Rose nightclub in early 1985. Gene had taken the gig out of desperation. It paid barely enough to cover gas money. The crowd was thin, maybe 30 people on a good night. As he stood on that tiny stage singing "Farewell Party" for what felt like the 1,000th time, something inside him broke. The man who'd once commanded standing ovations at the Grand Ole Opry was now providing background music for a half-empty bar, while patrons seemed more interested in their beer than his music. The tax debt had grown to over $250,000, an astronomical sum for the time. The IRS was threatening legal action, and the possibility of criminal charges loomed. Gene found himself sitting at his kitchen table late at night, trying to make sense of years of financial records, wondering how things had gone so wrong. The man who'd never wanted to be anything but a singer was now drowning in a sea of tax forms and legal documents. His health began to suffer under the strain. The stress of financial ruin, combined with the grueling schedule of any shows he could get, took its toll. He lost 30 pounds in 3 months. Chronic insomnia kept him up most nights, and the powerful voice that had never failed him began to show signs of wear. Some nights he could barely finish a show, his famous tenor cracking under the strain of exhaustion. The impact on his family was perhaps the hardest to bear. His children, who'd grown up proud of their father's success, now had to watch him struggle. Christmas that year was lean, with presents wrapped in newspaper and a dinner that was more about making do than celebrating. The man who'd once been able to provide everything his family needed now had to borrow money just to keep the lights on in their small rental house. But even at this darkest hour, when it seemed like Gene Watson's story was about to become just another cautionary tale of country music tragedy, something remarkable was about to happen. Because sometimes in country music, as in life, help comes from the most unexpected places. And for Gene Watson, that help would arrive in the form of two industry legends who hadn't forgotten what real country music was all about. The call that would change everything came on a rainy morning in March 1985. Gene Watson was sitting at his kitchen table, sorting through another pile of bills, when his phone rang. On the other end was George Jones, the possum himself. And what he said next would start Gene's journey back from the brink. "Son," Jones said, "I hear you're having some trouble. Well, I've been there, and I'm not about to let one of country music's best voices go silent." George Jones knew something about comebacks. He'd faced his own demons and emerged stronger. Now he was reaching out to a fellow artist in need. But Jones wasn't alone in his mission to help Gene Watson. Merle Haggard, another country music legend who appreciated authentic country voices, had also caught wind of Gene's situation. Within days, these two giants of country music put together a plan. They organized a benefit concert at the historic Ryman Auditorium, the mother church of country music. The lineup read like a who's who of traditional country. George Jones, Merle Haggard, Gene Watson, and special guests including Mo Bandy, John Anderson, and Ricky Skaggs. Every performer volunteered their time, with all proceeds going to help Gene settle his debts. The night of the concert, the old Ryman was packed to the rafters. Fans had come from all over the country, some driving hundreds of miles to show their support. The atmosphere was electric. This wasn't just a show, it was a statement about the country music community taking care of its own. When Gene took the stage that night, the applause was deafening. He opened with "Love in the Hot Afternoon," followed by "Should I Come Home or Should I Go Crazy?" But it was his performance of "Farewell Party" that brought the house down. This time, though, the song's message of saying goodbye had a different meaning. He was saying farewell to his darkest days. The benefit concert raised over $75,000, a significant sum in 1985. But more importantly, it showed Nashville that Gene Watson wasn't finished. Industry people who'd been avoiding his calls were suddenly interested again. The phone started ringing with booking offers. Even his record label began to reconsider their position. But Gene had learned his lessons the hard way. This time, he took control of his career. He hired a new manager, one recommended by George Jones, and brought in a certified accountant to handle his finances. Every contract was scrutinized, every dollar tracked. The man who'd once trusted others to handle his business was now making sure he understood every detail. He also made a crucial decision that would secure his future. He started his own publishing company, Gene Watson Music. No more would his songs and recordings be controlled by others. He began acquiring the rights to his earlier recordings when possible, ensuring that future royalties would come directly to him. This move, though risky at the time, would later prove to be one of his smartest business decisions. The road back wasn't easy. Gene took every gig he could get, gradually rebuilding his reputation one show at a time. He played smaller venues, county fairs, private events, anywhere that would help him chip away at his remaining debt. But this time, he was in control of his destiny. He even went back to doing some auto body work between shows, proving that the humble craftsman in him had never really left. By late 1985, he'd signed a new record deal with Epic Records, a label that understood and respected traditional country music. The contract, carefully reviewed by his new team, included full creative control and favorable royalty terms. Things he'd never had before? His first single for the label, Memories to Burn, shot into the top 5 on the country charts. The song's success proved that there was still a place for pure country music in an increasingly pop-oriented Nashville. His live shows began drawing bigger crowds again. Fans who'd stuck with him through the tough times were rewarded with performances that showed Gene Watson at his best. That magnificent voice, somehow even richer and more emotional for all he'd been through. He assembled a new farewell party band, this time with contracts that protected both him and his musicians. The support from his fellow artists continued. When word got around that Gene was back on his feet, others started recording his songs, generating valuable publishing income. Even some of the newer artists, the ones who'd grown up listening to his records, began citing him as an influence and reaching out for collaborations. By 1986, Gene Watson had accomplished something rare in country music, a genuine comeback that didn't compromise his artistic integrity. But the true legacy of his darkest days was yet to be revealed. Because what Gene Watson did next would not only secure his place in country music history, but would also change how many artists approach the business side of their careers. The story of Gene Watson's comeback could have ended there. Another tale of a country star who lost it all and fought his way back. But what happened next would prove even more important for country music's future. Throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Gene Watson became known for something beyond his perfect pitch and honky-tonk credentials. He became the go-to advisor for younger artists trying to navigate the treacherous waters of the music business. His office in Texas, where he still kept his auto body tools as a reminder of where he came from, became a stopping point for musicians seeking advice about the business side of their careers. "I learned the hard way," Gene would tell them, "so you don't have to." His publishing company, Gene Watson Music, grew into a model for other artists looking to maintain control of their work. He expanded it to help other traditional country artists protect their interests, showing them how to retain their publishing rights and manage their royalties effectively. This wasn't just about making money. It was about preserving the legacy of traditional country music. The impact of his experience reached far beyond his own career. In 1988, he helped establish the Traditional Country Music Association, an organization dedicated to protecting artists' financial interests while preserving the authentic sound of country music. The association provided resources and education about music business practices, helping countless artists avoid the pitfalls he'd encountered. His influence on the business side of country music was matched only by his continued artistic success. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, Gene proved that traditional country music could still find its audience. His albums for Epic Records, including Starting New Memories and Back in the Fire, showed that you didn't need to chase trends to remain relevant. Perhaps most importantly, Gene Watson became living proof that an artist could maintain their integrity while running a successful business. He never compromised his traditional sound, even as country music continued its pop evolution. Instead, he found ways to make traditional country commercially viable on his own terms. His live shows became master classes in both performance and professionalism. Young artists would stand in the wings, watching how he ran his band, managed his business, and still delivered those perfect notes night after night. Keith Whitley, before his untimely death, cited Gene as a major influence, not just musically, but professionally. Randy Travis, during his own rise to stardom, frequently sought Gene's advice about maintaining artistic integrity in a changing industry. The respect he earned during this period went beyond the country music world. Music business programs at universities began using his story as a case study in artist management and financial planning. His experience became a blueprint for how artists could maintain control of their careers while staying true to their artistic vision. By the mid-1990s, Gene Watson had achieved something remarkable. He'd transformed his darkest moment into a legacy of education and empowerment for other artists. His financial collapse and comeback had helped create a new generation of business-savvy musicians who understood the importance of managing their own careers. Today, Gene Watson's influence can still be felt throughout country music. His insistence on maintaining creative control while understanding the business side of music helped pave the way for the independent artist movement. Modern country stars like Miranda Lambert and Eric Church, who maintain strong control over their careers while staying true to their artistic vision, are following a path that Gene Watson helped forge. But the story doesn't end there, because in today's music industry, where streaming has changed everything and artists face new challenges Gene Watson couldn't have imagined in 1984, his lessons about maintaining control and staying true to your artistic vision are more relevant than ever. And what he's doing now might surprise you. Today, at 80 years old, Gene Watson still tours regularly, playing to packed houses across the country. That magnificent voice remains strong, a testament to his dedication to pure country music. He's still recording too. His 2020 album, Real Country Music, debuted in the top 20 on Billboard's Country Albums chart. But perhaps his greatest achievement is visible in the faces of young artists who still seek him out for advice. In an era of streaming and social media, his hard-learned lessons about maintaining artistic and financial control are more relevant than ever. When asked about those dark days in 1984, Gene Watson just smiles. Sometimes, he says, you have to lose everything to find out what really matters. For me, that was staying true to real country music and making sure I understood every aspect of the business behind it.